Welcome into this week's episode of the Tech Ed Podcast. My name is Matt Kirchner. I am your host. How many times have we said here on the Tech Ed Podcast that I was and continue to be a hands-on kinesthetic learner? I was never a classroom learner. I was never very good at learning by reading, but when I could get my hands on something, when I could do something physically, that's when all of the learning came together for me. Project-based learning was my way of learning. We're going to talk all about that today on this episode of the Tech Ed Podcast, how bringing students' learning right into their haptic zone, showing them how they can engage with learning, makes that learning stick, makes it that much more effective. And we're having that conversation with our guest, Dr. Kristin Wobbe. She goes by Kris. She's the director of the Center for Project-Based Learning at the Worcester Polytechnic Institute. Dr. Wobbe, thank you so much for being here.
I'm delighted to be here with you.
So, Kris, thank you so much for joining us. I want to talk to you about all the great things that are happening there at the Worcester Polytechnic Institute. We'll get into what your organization is all about, what your institution is all about. But I know you made a major shift in the way that you were delivering learning, and the institution did, all the way back in the 1970s, and really taking that lockstep curriculum that so many of us experienced during our journey through education and changing that into something that was considerably different. So tell us about what drove that specific decision and maybe the problem you were trying to solve, or the institution anyway, was trying to solve now some 40 or 50 years ago.
Well, it was then, as it is now, a time of declining enrollments. And so one of the concerns was how to make the education more relevant to our incoming students and make it more attractive to them. But the way that we went about it was one of our esteemed leaders decided to put young faculty in charge of re-envisioning the curriculum. And I think that was really an important step. And the young faculty were less wedded to what was happening and looked around and thought, not only do we need to make it more attractive to students, probably we need to reimagine it so it better serves them as they leave, and that we are providing them with more of the skills and abilities they're going to need post being in a classroom. And therefore, they developed this curriculum that was really built around projects.
How interesting is it that in this day and age, when we're talking about declining enrollments in higher education for all kinds of reasons, right? I mean, we've got demographic reasons, that it's just the pure math of how many students were being born, 15, 20 years ago and are now considering what they do after high school and post-secondary, and that's a factor. We've got changing perceptions about higher education, where it fits, where it doesn't fit, all of these things that are facing higher education. And what you're saying to me is that if we look back into the 1970s, when institutions were facing a similar challenge and they recognized they needed to do things a little bit differently to continue to attract students and make the learning meaningful for them, here we are again now, some 40 or 50 years later, facing the same kind of challenges. Isn't that interesting? Do you agree?
I do agree.
So if we think about this whole model of project-based learning and think about it in a more broad sense, what are some of the misconceptions you would say that other institutions that are maybe sticking to a more traditional classroom, sage on the stage, lecture type of learning, what are those misconceptions that they would have about a polytechnic education?
There are a lot of barriers, I would say, to adopting project-based learning. But if we want to focus on misconceptions, I think probably the most common one is that students need to know all the things before they can do a project. They got to cram all this information into their brains first before you let them loose.
Right.
They don't see the project itself as the avenue to learning.
Interesting. I had a mentor a long time ago, and that individual taught me and it was really more of a business lesson, but it was all about the idea that you don't need to know everything about something in order to dive in, as long as you have the confidence that you're going to figure it out along the way. And in so many ways, that is what learning is all about. So is that what I'm hearing from you, is that it's this process of, I don't have all the answers when I jump into the hands-on version of learning, polytechnic version of learning, that I can figure it out along the way? Is that a good way of putting it?
Sure. And that's really much more effective, because it's one thing to be told you're going to need to know something. And it's another thing to be confronted with, I need to find something out to be able to do the thing I want to do. That's
Absolutely
immediately more motivating to learn the thing.
Isn't that right? Right. You're going on this exploration. You're not starting with all the answers and then just going through and checking the boxes. I love your way of thinking about this. I love the way that you get this whole model started so early in the process as well. Now, I understand that you helped launch the first year project-based experience. This goes all the way back to 2007. So we're talking about 18 years ago. So talk about that. And I'm not trying to date either one of us, but man, it's crazy just to think that here we are in 2025. You were doing this 18 years ago. What does that program look like and how have you evolved it over the course of those 18 years?
It started with an idea that, so we developed this project-based curriculum, but a lot of the major projects don't happen until the students are further advanced in their careers. And students were coming and saying, but I want to start a project now. So it was partly driven by the students and partly by the recognition that if we wanted students to perform well in projects downstream in their education, it would help to have projects upstream. And so the Great Problem Seminars were conceived. And these are a 2-course sequence specifically for first-year students. And each course in the sequence is focused around one of the world's big problems. And of course, the world has many big problems, so it's not hard to find one.
Right.
And we put together 2 faculty from different disciplines, usually a humanistic discipline and then a technical discipline. And they had 40 to 60 students. And in the first course in the sequence, the 2 faculty work with the students to help them understand sort of the depth, breadth, and complexity of the problem and to look at it from a variety of disciplinary perspectives, their own, of course, but other ones that are really important. And also to see that who you are and where you are really affects how you will perceive the problem or experience the problem and maybe see a whole different side of it than somebody in your community with a different kind of identity or somebody in a different community in a different part of the world. And while they are doing this, the students are doing little projects in teams that help them develop that content knowledge, but also help them develop skills around finding information, communicating orally, written, and visually, working with partners to solve a problem. And at the end of that first course, they're then ready to dive into the second one where with the same faculty, same students, the students divide themselves into small teams of about 4, and each team picks a small piece of that big problem and localizes it. So we're going to solve maybe a hunger problem for this community or this part of this community. And then they have to spend some time figuring out how big a problem that is. Why is it a problem? What are the consequences of the problem? Then how would people solve this problem somewhere else? And what are 2 potential solutions that will work here? And then what would it take to implement one of those solutions? If you do a compare and contrast, what are the benefits and drawbacks of the 2? Pick one and develop how that could work. And at the end of this, the students present, they have a report, and then we have a giant poster session. So all the students who are in one of these present at the same time, and we invite the entire campus and the student parents and the community, and everybody comes. And it's delightful to see these students who were a week and a half before really anxious that they weren't going to be able to do all of this, now very proudly standing in front of their poster and saying, look, we did a thing. We had an idea. And it's evolved a lot over the 18 years. We developed a cadre of folks who are really dedicated to the program and did a lot of sharing. Co-teaching with someone involves a lot of sharing, but then we developed this really nice network and learned what works well and what doesn't and shared that across the network. And eventually we decided we had enough expertise that we even wrote a book about it.
Did you really? All right. We'll be sure and link that book up in the show notes for any of our listeners that are interested in learning more about that. So many different directions we can go on that last discussion. First of all, it sounds like in the first semester, all the students are working on the same general problem, right? So we pick a problem for that first semester. Is that right? Or is it multiple?
There are multiple problems. And so the students can decide, are they more interested in studying the problem of energy or of sustainability or of shelter or of food or healthcare? And it's an optional project. Not all of our students complete this one, but they do have the option and they get to pick what sounds most interesting.
Got it. Have the topics or the problems evolved over the course of that period of time? Do they change, or is it pretty much the same topics every year?
We've added and subtracted some. I would say probably our most topical one is we had one this year for the first time on artificial intelligence.
Wow.
We weren't even thinking about back in 2007.
For sure. Yeah. Who was talking about AI, and now who isn't talking about AI in this day and age? We certainly speak a lot about it here on the Tech Ed podcast. A couple other things that just occur to me as you're going through that answer. One of them, we had a guest really early on in the podcast, Dr. Sue Elsperman, who at the time was the president of Ivy Tech, which is the technical college system in the state of Indiana. And she 3 degrees in engineering, had a baccalaureate degree, a master's, and a PhD in engineering, and talked about on the engineering side, some of the challenges that she saw in higher education were that you would put engineers in a course and have them work through all their calculus and all their physics and all their really rigorous math courses before you kind of figured out if they were good enough to get to the fun stuff. And she said, wouldn't it be great if we started with the fun stuff? And it sounds like that's kind of the logic. Are you hearing that from your students? Do they like diving right in that first semester? Does that help with recruiting?
It does help a little bit with recruiting, and it helps even more, I think, students identify things that they can see doing with their education. So if you're taking calculus and physics and basic chemistry, it's hard to see what is that going to be good for.
Right.
And so having these courses can help them see, as a chemist or a biomedical engineer or an electrical engineer, I can actually work on water problems. I hadn't thought about, but water is a big problem.
I love the way that gives them context for that continuing education. I also like the way that you're pulling faculty from various disciplines within the institution. This whole project-based learning idea doesn't begin and end with that first year. I know as students get into their junior year, this whole theme continues. Walking through that experience, then their junior year, they do what you're calling an interactive qualifying project, usually focused on integrating, again, my understanding, science, technology, and society, which I think is an interesting word to kind of throw in there. Tell us about that experience and what's the objective of that junior year project?
I'm going to start with the objective.
Sure.
Because those faculty back in the 70s recognized it was a time when technological advances were happening quite rapidly, right? And there was some sense that the science was moving faster than our ability to wrap our heads around what the consequences were. And so one of the objectives of this project is to help students understand that there are consequences to the work they do, that whatever we're doing, it's going to affect people, and thinking about what might be the impacts downstream of whatever it is we're working on. And as we've continued this project, we've also recognized that it works the other way too. That what we decide are problems and what we decide to work on and how we decide to work on them are also influenced by the society we are in. And so there's this two-way street, and helping students recognize that early in their careers was seen as really important.
Absolutely. It's not just that one-way learning. It's actually a two-way experience. And it's not just what are we going to learn about, what are we going to participate, but how does that work that we're doing then affect other things and our place in the world? And really, really important to get that context as well. So give us a little bit more of a feel of that whole interactive qualifying project and how that feels for the student.
This is probably the most distinctive thing about a WPI education. So this project is the equivalent of 3 classes. They always do it with a faculty advisor, sometimes one, sometimes more than one working with them. They're working at some issue or problem at the intersection of science, technology, and society. And they conclude with a fairly substantial report and sometimes other things. And they can do this in one of 2 ways. The way the smallest number of our students do it is by doing this on top of taking a couple other classes. And so it extends over some period of the year to the equivalent of 3 classes worth of work. But the way more of our students, almost like 80% of our students do this, is they do it as an immersive one-term experience. And we have, over the 50 years, developed a suite of 50 project centers where we send students and faculty to a place, and those places are located all over the world, where they spend 7 weeks working intensively with a project sponsor. And in these projects in particular, they're all brought by local organization. It can be a government, it can be a non-governmental organization, a nonprofit, a small business. They have a problem that they want somebody to solve. And our students come in, they learn about the problem, they provide solutions. And to make sure that they can be most effective in 7 weeks, that's a pretty short period of time.
For sure.
Before they go, they have a prep class where they're learning what their project is and doing some background research on it so that they've already got a plan by the time they arrive. And so that's a really transformative experience for our students. And for many of them, the first time they're really working in a professional environment, in interdisciplinary teams on something that's not their major.
Any specific projects that come to mind as you think about it that provide a particularly good example of what that experience is like for the students?
Well, I had the privilege of being able to advise a group of some 20 plus students who went to Melbourne, Australia. And we had several different project teams. One was working with a local museum who wanted to assess the value of their collection that was not on display. And so the students had to learn about how do you evaluate that sort of thing? How do you value that? We had another group that was working with a community organization that wanted to develop a curriculum for late teens, early 20s around climate adaptation for their organization. We had another that was working with a nonprofit that wanted help developing materials to get more corporate sponsorships.
Yeah, very cool examples. And help me understand how the credit side of it works. I assume they're earning college credits as they're doing that work. How does that fit into the overall course sequence?
Well, the beautiful thing is they're required to do the project, so it doesn't have to count in any particular discipline. It's just you have to do this project in order to graduate. And it's 3 courses worth of credit, and they get grades for the work they do in these projects.
And just another question, and it's totally out of curiosity. So they're going off to some other, this project for 7 weeks. How does that fit into a typical semester, and how do you make that work with the rest of the course schedule?
Well, that's because we don't have typical semesters. We made it easy. So one of the other changes we made in the 70s to accommodate exactly this kind of thing is our semesters have been divided into 2, and our students take 3 classes for 7 weeks, and then we take a break, and then they come back and take 3 more classes for 7 weeks. So it fits neatly into one of those slots.
Got it. So it's almost like 4 quarters, almost maybe like I had in high school. I don't want to compare it, but right. So it has more of that feel to it. Very, very interesting and a really, really creative way to do it. Now the project-based learning doesn't end then with your junior year because you're heading into your senior year. And now you've got we talked about the interactive qualifying project. Now we have the major qualifying project. Tell us about that next step in terms of the project-based learning.
That's another graduation requirement. All of our students have to complete this. It's another project that is the equivalent of 3 courses. So it's a quarter of the work the seniors do. And they all are engaged in doing something in their major. So that's the major qualifying project part. So this is a capstone, but a pretty in-depth capstone. And the projects can be sourced from faculty, so they get involved in faculty research projects, or from corporations that want students to work on developing a new thingy. And they're all done also under the supervision of a faculty member who evaluates the work that they're doing and gives them a grade in the end.
Fascinating. And so, the project-based learning sequence continues all the way through their entire higher education journey. Really, really valuable. What do you hear from students in terms of, your graduates or as they're going through these projects? Are they finding these experiences are differentiators when they get to the workforce or when they're starting their career search or their search for whatever comes after their undergrad?
Yeah, we really do. Even the students who are completing our Great Problem Seminar, that first year project, if they go on interviews for internships or for that summer job, we've had them come back and say, they said they never take first year, rising sophomores. But because I was able to talk about my project, I was able to get this valuable experience. And similarly, our students, when they are leaving WPI and going into the workforce, we have employers who are delighted to come back year after year after year and hire our students. And I've sat next to some of them at, the luncheons that we have for the recruiters and had them say, we recruit from all over, but WPI students really know how to get right to work from day one. And I think the projects are a big part of that. But honestly, I think 7-week terms have something to do with that too.
Absolutely. That's a really interesting way of looking at it. It harkens back to me of conversations I've had with people in industry who, a lot of times, and we've got, tons of 4-year engineering degree people working in our businesses. We're certainly, not disparaging that path at all. But a lot of folks have said, hey, when they get here, they're brilliant and we know they're going to add a ton of value for our business, but it's a year or 2 before they're really boots on the ground, understand the business inside and out, comfortable in the field, on the shop floor, those kind of things. And it feels like through these experiences your students are having, they're being prepared perfectly for those types of challenges that they're going to face once they get into the workplace. And I think that's really, really interesting. The other thing that I think is super interesting is something that you mentioned just a little while ago, Kris, and I'm going to go down a little bit of a rabbit hole. Actually, two things you mentioned. One was artificial intelligence. And like we said, you can't go a day without having some conversation or reading something about AI. The other one was the importance of teaming a technical faculty member from the humanities side, if I got that right, or at least I'm close. I've been spending a lot of time thinking about, in part because of some of the reading I've done recently, in this age of AI, they talk about a few different steps. I'm going to get wonky on you, and then we'll come back to a little more straightforward question. So I don't want to scare the audience or my guest at the moment. But as we think about artificial intelligence and we get into the age of what they call, artificial and general intelligence. So AGI, the idea that machine learning and artificial intelligence can do all the things that a human can do, or at least most of them can reason like humans, and then get into super intelligence where the AI is actually smarter, further ahead, quicker than human beings are. And what happens to our world when that happens, when we literally have artificial intelligence, when we literally have machine learning, when we have supercomputers that are literally smarter, quicker, and better at reasoning than human beings. And the whole question becomes one of ethics, in my opinion. And how do we balance technology and then all these ethical questions that come along with what it means to be a human, what it means to be an ethical human, doing the right thing, and so on. And so I think we're going to see a push over the course of the next 5 to 10 years as more and more people start to realize that we've got to have a focus on the humanities along with all of these technical skills. And I'm a big believer that if you're just going to go after a degree in the humanities with nothing else that rides along with that, you may find some challenges early on when you get to the workforce, maybe not. If you can marry the two of those, the technology side and the humanities side together, that's what really creates a well-rounded 4-year degreed individual. I know that that's buried, and not just buried, but built right into your programming. So talk a little bit about the importance of both the technical and the human side of education.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. The technical is super important, mostly to help students get confidence that they can handle technical stuff, right? We all know that technology changes really fast. So what we're teaching them right now might be outmoded and shortly after they graduate. So having the confidence that they can learn that stuff is very important. But the humanities and arts are also super important. I mean, our students are primarily traditional college-age students, and that's a super important time for figuring out who you are, what the world is, what's your place in the world, what do you want your place in the world to be, what do you want your world to be? And the humanities and arts really go a long way to help with that. But even more, we've learned from doing some analysis of alumni surveys that humanities and arts are also helpful for helping the students learn the technical parts of their work.
Tell us about that. That's interesting.
Yeah. And we think some of these are indirect, that in the humanities and arts, they're obviously focusing a lot on communication, no matter which of those they're working in. They're finding information in a different set of disciplines. And being able to find information across disciplines becomes really important.
For sure.
They're learning how to think critically about the problem. And so they can think more critically about, what problem am I trying to solve? Is it the problem that's being put before me, or is there an underlying problem? And so all of those skills help them in their technical disciplines as well. And so we see folks who do their humanities and arts curriculum early do actually better in their technical work later on.
We hear students a lot of times as they're learning, for example, complex math or integrals or derivatives and these kind of things, and they're like, why do I need to learn this? And there's some real important reasons why that's important. I can tell you as a student who's a product of a Jesuit higher education where we went deep into the humanities, right? Even in business school, 9 credits in philosophy, 9 credits in theology. And if you want to hear students saying, why do we have to learn this? Boy, you'll hear a lot in those kind of courses. But then you come through that coursework and you realize that you have this ability to think and communicate about abstract concepts. And if you can communicate at that level and think at that level, I think you're exactly right. You bring that back to technology, and not just for the reasons of ethics and for philosophical reasons, but the ability to communicate in ways that you weren't otherwise able to. And so I think that's why it's so important that we keep all of this as part of higher education, and credit to you and to WPI for doing exactly that. Credit to you as well for now having 85%, as I understand it, of faculty incorporating projects into their course courses. So literally 85% of your faculty members are putting some type of project into the coursework. Over half of the student work is project-based, and I love that. So talk a little bit more about what you're seeing, not just in terms of the student outcomes, but in how faculty and students are approaching their learning together.
Well, that's such a fun question because I think there is such a difference when you do that. Projects really open the door to curiosity and creativity in ways that traditional classrooms don't always do that. We also, because we do co-teaching in our Great Problem Seminar and we do co-advising with many of our big projects, both the interactive and the major qualifying project, we have a lot more collaboration between faculty so that teaching becomes less of a solo enterprise and more of a shared journey. And we share resources with each other, and collaboration is fun. But I think it also helps us understand more about what's important to be learned. So there's content learning that absolutely is important. Don't want to discredit that. But there's also process learning and understanding how we also need to help our students learn how to work well together in teams. We also need to help them learn how to perspective take from some other perspective. So it just provides a broadening of what's important to be learned and can also, for me, and I'll speak for myself, a lot of the details that academics so love are really not so important for our students, right? We appreciate the intricacy and the beauty of our discipline and the nuance, but most of our students just need to know this thing because they're going to go do something with that that's not study all the nuance and intricacy of our discipline, right?
For sure.
And I think it helps all of us see that more clearly. So we tend to be able to focus more on the big picture things.
It's refreshing to hear you say that. And speaking of those faculty members, 50 years on, obviously the folks that are delivering the learning today, you may have some of them left over from 50 years ago, but by and large, probably not many. And so you've had this turnover in faculty. Does this approach, this Polytechnic hands-on project-based learning approach to education attract a certain type of faculty member?
Yeah, I think it does. I know for myself, when I came to WPI, I was excited to come to some place where they valued both the research and the teaching. And some of our most amazing faculty have that same desire that they want to be able to make an impact on the student, not just on their field. And then knowing that you're going to do projects, and it's probably something different than what most of our faculty experienced in the past. You have to be kind of risk takers and really curious about what that's going to be. And I think that's really helpful.
And risk takers, and I would think in some ways being able to act on the fly. You think about the traditional kind of classroom, sage on the stage version of learning. There weren't a lot of surprises necessarily, maybe a question that came out of left field, but not a lot of surprises for the faculty member. They've really got to be able to think on their feet in this particular model as well, don't they?
Well, they do. And I think that is one of the barriers to more places adopting project-based learning. Faculty very much have built a persona of being an expert. And that's, of course they have. Of course I did.
Right.
And then when you feel like you're going into a classroom, you're going into that classroom as an expert. And to go into that classroom and know that somebody's going to ask you a question that you don't know the answer to is kind of scary until you say, but I can't know all the answers to all the questions. And so we're going to go in and say, but I'm really good at finding out answers to questions. And I can help you find out the answer to your question. So let's find it together.
Absolutely. Learn how to learn together. I love that.
Yeah.
Dr. Kristin Wobbe, the director of the Center for Project-Based Learning in Worcester at the Worcester Polytechnic Institute, WPI, is our guest on the Tech Ed podcast. And now you're co-directing, I should say, Kris, this Center for Project-Based Learning. Tell us a little bit about what that center itself does and how you're helping other institutions take the first steps towards this type of learning.
So the center is a very small outward-facing unit of WPI whose mission is to help faculty at other higher ed institutions advance project-based learning on their own campuses. And we recognized about 10 years ago that we had accumulated decades worth of expertise in how to do this well, and that we really believe in it and feel that students are better trained that way. And so it sort of felt like an obligation we had to help others. And so we do it in a couple of different ways, well, multiple ways, two major ways. I will work with other institutions to craft custom workshops for their faculty. And it might be just a department or a program or just a bunch of interested faculty who want to figure out how to do either more project-based learning or better project-based learning or just start down that path. And so we do that. And then our flagship thing is we have an institute on project-based learning that we run every summer, where we invite both teams from institutions or individuals to come. And we host a series of workshops and keynotes, all on various aspects of using project-based learning, and provide all of the participants with a coach so that when they leave, they have an action plan for what they're going to do when they go back to their campus to further project-based learning, where they are in the way they want to with their students. And I think it's really important that everybody knows we understand everybody's situation is different. Students are different, resources are different, schedules are different. We have to be able to accommodate all of that.
So in this summer learning that happens, who's attracted to that? Is that faculty or is it deans? Is it chancellors? I mean, who are the kind of folks that are coming to learn about how to implement project-based learning?
All of the above. Usually it's faculty. Often it's something that is supported by the institution's Center for Teaching and Learning, whatever they may call that. Or there's a dean or a provost that's all about, we need to change our traditional classroom teaching to something that is seen as more valuable and has a group of faculty that are eager to participate in that. So, and librarians. Sometimes we get librarians and they're amazing. Love librarians.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of the most inquisitive and fascinating and well-studied people on the planet. I can't argue with that for a moment. I totally agree with you. So as they're coming and they're learning about project-based learning, I can just tell you as someone who spends a lot of time around higher education and quite frankly, a lot of time liking to see the traditional model upended a little bit, because I think there's a lot of things that we're doing well, but a lot of things that we can do better in higher education. One of the things I hear most frequently from whether it's faculty, a program director, or a provost for that matter, when we talk about making some changes to the typical learning that's happening in a typical institution, is there's not enough room in the course, there's not enough room in the syllabus. We've got these standards we have to meet. The HLC is coming next month. I mean, all of these reasons why we can't innovate. What's the message to those folks who are saying, look, our models are pretty well set. There isn't enough room in what we're doing now to make changes. How would you recommend they go about thinking about making those changes?
It is one of the questions I get most often. My class is full. We're so busy. We can't possibly add anything to it. And then I have a couple of questions I ask as well. Okay, how much of what's in your course needs to be there? How long has it been since you took a step back and looked at what it is that you're teaching and said, I don't know, am I teaching this because it's been taught this way for the past fill in the blank number of years?
100 years sometimes, yeah.
And is all of this still as relevant as it was? Is the emphasis still in the right place? So some of it is, maybe it's time to do a little house cleaning in our courses. And that's not true for all of them, but I certainly know in my biochemistry classes, that was one of the things I had to do. And I did it, and I was so happy afterwards.
Yeah, right.
But then the other thing to consider is, how can a project help you accomplish all of the learning objectives you have? What could you replace in your course with a project so that you're not cutting anything out, you're just swapping.
Delivering it a different way.
Yep.
Yeah. I love that. I love that way of thinking. And it's probably an easier sell is probably the wrong word, but it's probably an easier sell to someone who's a little bit worried about that disruption is, look, your students are going to walk out of your class at the end of the semester or the end of the quarter, or whatever we call it, with the same knowledge. We have the same learning outcomes. We're just delivering them in a little different way. And oh, by the way, because every learner is going to learn a little bit different way, we may even have more learning taking place. In fact, I would argue that we will have more learning taking place because of the interactive nature of the learning itself. So I think it's a great message for anybody working in higher education who's trying to figure out how do we disrupt the model a little bit without totally upending the apple cart in terms of what we're doing and what we're delivering and what we're teaching, but just doing it in a slightly different, or in some cases a radically different way, but with the same, if not better, results. So I know one of the questions our audience is going to have, Kris, as they're hearing this is, this is great for a Polytechnic institution. You've got the name Polytechnic right in the name of the institution. institution. Clearly, this is, your reason for existing. If I'm a typical liberal arts institution, more traditional model, does this model work there, or is it really just for those institutions that have already decided hands-on learning and polytechnic project-based learning is right for us?
Well, we have worked with all kinds of institutions, and I'm pretty sure I can say all. We've worked with the Air Force Academy. We've worked with the New England Conservatory of Music. We've worked with four-year liberal arts institutions. We've worked with regional publics and flagship publics in a whole range of disciplines. It's easily adaptable. And we've worked with community colleges. So I can give you some examples of some of the things that our partners have done. So College of the Canyons, it's in Southern California, and they've got faculty who are heavily engaged in getting civic engagement. And one of the projects came out of a class on making movies, and they did digital stories of survivals of the Holocaust. The students drew sort of cartoons and they put it to music over the voice of somebody talking about their experience. Another class did a children's book about birds. That was the class project. So it can work in all kinds of disciplines, in all kinds of institutions. It just takes faculty and students willing to engage in it.
So you think about hands-on or polytechnic learning, I think for a lot of folks, immediately what would come to mind would be something like an engineering program or maybe a healthcare program where you kind of immediately go to the hands-on nature of the learning. And what we're hearing, and you're clearly demonstrating, is this project-based learning model is going to work almost regardless of what the discipline is that we're learning in. There's an opportunity for us to integrate project-based learning in a really interactive, meaningful way, not just for the students, but for the community as well. Again, as we think about the changing world of education, our place in education and education's place in society, every one of our guests has some experience, some paradigm, some perception of education that would surprise a lot of people. And it doesn't matter whether there's somebody that's working in education right now, like you are, somebody that went through their education experience and hung on to some surprising thing that they came up with that they just thought would be interesting to the rest of the world. Is there something about your education journey or education in general, a belief that you have that would surprise other people?
Well, maybe several, but
okay, we got time. Go ahead.
The one that I'm thinking the most about now is I don't really believe that the way we structure our education around disciplines, right? You've got an English class, you've got a science class, you've got a math class. I don't think that best serves our students or their learning. And focusing things more around questions or problems or situations where you could learn the same stuff, but in service of something that you can really engage in, and where the students see the connections between, I need to know this math to be able to answer this science question, and then I have to write it up with good English and some nice visuals so that everybody will know what I know, right? And so I would blow up departments and rejigger things.
I love that. Blow up departments and rejigger things. I love thinking about how we could totally reimagine higher education in that regard. And I think that was a terrific and perfect answer to that question. One last question. I would love for you to go back to that age of 15, that time when you are a sophomore in high school as an example. And if you could go back and give that young Kris just a little bit of advice, what would that advice be?
I mean, the first thing I thought was, well, what would 15-year-old Kris be willing to hear?
Yeah, right. Exactly. It doesn't matter what you think if it's not received, right?
Yeah. And so in the end, I decided that, I was a very driven, high-achieving high school student. And I think I would say, maybe it's okay to have more fun.
Mm-hmm.
Have more fun.
Absolutely. And that's good advice for a 15-year-old or for a 55-year-old or for an 85-year-old in general, is to have more fun. And I think that's absolutely perfect advice. We've certainly had a tremendous amount of fun today with our guest, Dr. Kristin Wobbe, the director of the Center for Project-Based Learning at Worcester Polytechnic Institute. Absolutely fascinating conversation. Kris, I love the way that you are blowing up the model in terms of higher education and have been now the institution for over 50 years. Absolutely great things happening there. Can't thank you enough for taking some time for us here on the Tech Ed Podcast.
Well, it was delightful to be with you, Matt. Thank you so much.
and a delightful episode with our guest, Dr. Kristin Wobbe. Thanks so much to our audience for joining us this week. We had some interesting references and resources that we talked about over the course of the discussion today. We will make sure and put those in the show notes for our audience, as always. And every week we have the best show notes in the business and the best social media presence in all of technical education as well. You'll find the Tech Ed Podcast all over Facebook and TikTok. You'll find us on LinkedIn. You will find us on Instagram. Wherever you go for your social media, you will find the Tech Ed Podcast. And we hope to find you here again next week when we will be with you with another great episode. Thanks so much for being with us.